Hello, my name is Kyle Steele. I'm running for Norman City Council Ward 6 in the upcoming election cycle, and this is the summary of what happened at the October 28th, 2025 City Council meeting. A large portion of this meeting at the beginning was centered around the recommendation for Robert Bruce to take over the Ward 3 seat that was vacated by Bree Montoya. She resigned essentially after receiving a lot of backlash for comments that she made in social media. The committee's recommendation was 3-2 for Robert Bruce, and there was kind of an interesting back and forth going on. There were some allegations that this meeting was a little bit more politicized than it should for a nonpartisan position. You know, several committee members kind of spoke about what went on there to kind of defend the process, and there was also a lot of there was a few Ward 3 citizens who were concerned about the selection, about how Robert Bruce may not accurately reflect Bree Montoya's policies, and if he was going to be representative of Ward 3. You know, the argument was essentially made that, you know, they elected Bree Montoya for this specific set of policies, and the replacement should mirror those policies as close as possible. You know, there was kind of like some back and forth discussion with like the questions and everything. Ultimately, what ended up happening though is Robert Bruce was confirmed to be the Ward 3 replacement counselor by a 7-1 vote. The one nay vote came from Ward 7 council member Blodgett. As a reminder, you know, council member Bruce now it will be serving until the results of the election, for a special election that is occurring this February. So if someone wins outright in February, that person will presumably be sworn in ASAP to replace Bruce. And if there's a runoff, then, you know, he will be serving as the interim Ward 3 council person until the April runoff when that is decided. Next came the proclamations, announcements, and the consent docket. This all went as expected. There was no kind of noteworthy things that kind of happened or were pulled. It's just, you know, hey, business as usual. The next section of the council after this was regarding the removal of the Peeping Tom charge from the city ordinance, and this was actually a pretty interesting conversation. Ultimately, the Norman PD, their representative, they advocated for the removal of this Peeping Tom charge, because essentially how it works is there is a municipal level Peeping Tom charge, and then there is a state level one. And if you remove it at the city level, then it forces officers to file these charges at a state level, and that allows for easier tracking of serial offenders for this charge, especially if they escalate into bigger crimes, as sometimes they do. As it turns out, the city of Norman isn't the municipal court isn't a court of record, as they call it, which I'll talk about after this. But essentially, you know, the argument was, hey, if we don't have this charge, it becomes a state level charge by default, and it allows for better tracking. And from an investigatory standpoint, it's easier to catch these offenders if they're being looked into. There was some concerns that if this charge was gotten rid of, you know, would police just be letting people off with warning because they don't want to have to deal with the process of filing with the state, or, you know, maybe they just had concerns that this, you know, this wasn't a state level worthy charge, whereas, you know, in the municipal court it's like a, you know, there it's misdemeanors in both, but the municipal court doesn't go on their record, so people might be more willing to file a municipal charge over the state charge. Ultimately, however, this did pass unanimously, so this will be dropped from the ordinance. However, the state level charge will obviously still be in effect. As far as the municipal court of record kind of side conversation that they have, essentially, there when you do have to go to municipal court, there is no standard judge there. You know, there might be a judge that like comes in to rule on the case, but it's not a dedicated judge for the Norman municipal court filings that are going on. And there's also no court reporter for these proceedings, so they're not considered on your record. Now, there are talks of potentially, maybe down the line, turning Norman from a not court of record into a court of record. However, the long story short on that is, while there is space for that, it's really a staffing concern. You know, if you want to make something to a court of record, you most likely have to have a few judges who are consistently part of that court, you know, and then the staff to support them, as well as a court reporter to notate what's going on in that courtroom, and so it could be, you know, filed appropriately and officially in accordance with state laws. And this is all money that the city doesn't have at this sort of, or at this moment in time, rather. Essentially, the amount of money that the municipal court brings in through all these municipal violations that are going on, it would not cover all this additional staff. Now, there is maybe the possibility of grants or funding from like a state or a federal level to help with those staffing issues down the line, but that's a conversation for another day, and maybe even another year that the council will potentially look into. But there is some support for getting Norman to be a court of record, essentially. The final item that was on this business portion was essentially the approval of a preliminary plat for the property that is located behind Norman North High School, next to kind of a retention pond that was there. Essentially, the plan that was submitted was to turn this area into a mixed-use PUD, as they call it, to allow for either a variety of residential properties, or, you know, kind of like a residential on the ground floor, as well as apartments above it. There's been a few requests for this to come through lately. There was some concerns from some members of the community over use of PUDs, and if it's, you know, valid to be using PUDs under these circumstances, as well as the general loss of green space that is occurring when these developments go up around Norman. However, all that being said, the plat did end up passing unanimously. In the public comment section, there was a variety of concerns over, you know, things like traffic, and then again the continued ethics of sitting on a city council and what that means. I'll link that down below for those who were interested. But overall, this was a very long meeting, clocking in at about 4 hours for just a few items of business. So with all that being said, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns about the meeting or about me or my campaign in general, feel free to email me at KyleForNorman@gmail.com, or you can visit my website at KyleForNorman.com. Thank you. Have a good evening.